All right, Tuborowski. Another edition of Fibs and Lies about the Middle East. Number 4, I believe, or Flame, as in the October 10th edition of The Nation. Okay? And we turn here, page 23, to see another edition of Flame. Are the Palestinians ready for peace? Why Arab intransigence makes peace most unlikely. Just as all the presidents since Harry Truman before him, President Obama is spending much time, effort, and political capital trying to bring about peace between Israel and the Palestinian Arabs, if history is any guide, he will be as unsuccessful in this endeavor, but just as every one of his predecessors, if I can read this small print. So what are the facts? Well, rest assured we won't find them here, but we will get to them. Many attempts at peace. In order to understand the unlikelihood of peace in the Middle East, it is necessary to trace the history of peacemaking attempts between Israel and the Palestinians. Virtually all of them resulted in complete failure. Here is a list of only the most important of such events. The enmity of the Arabs against the Jews in their midst and the violence against them predates the creation of the Jewish state. There were some peace proposals during the British Mandate prior to 1948, but they were in vain and deserve little mention in this narrative. Of course, notable was the Peel Commission proposal in 1937, in which the creation of an Arab state was suggested, but the Arabs rejected it. Well, here's why it was rejected. They already had possession of the land. British political rule in Palestine was seen by the Arabs as part of the general swindle of the Western powers after World War I over the Arab colonies of the defeated Ottoman Empire. If history is too dry for you, just watch a rerun of Lawrence of Arabia, where the Sykes-Picot Treaty is mentioned. Rather than deliver the Arab liberation the Allies promised to the Arab leaders, France and England divided Ottoman Arabia between them, France getting the present-day Syria and Lebanon, Britain getting Mesopotamia, Iraq in other words, and Palestine, which included all of present-day Israel, Jordan, and territories between, but not then Gaza. The Balfour Declaration of 1917 that promised a Jewish state in Palestine was, from the point of view of the majority in residence, merely trading in other people's land without consideration for their rights. In fact, if there had been a considerable Christian Arab population in Palestine, the Arabs there would not have been given such a casual brush-off by Britain. In that case, there might not have even been an Israel, with the Christian Arabs serving as the basis of a proxy protectorate. But they were expendable Muslims, so the Western conscience was unruffled. So that was the basis of Arab rejectionism and the Arab revolt in arms of the 1930s. This goes on to say, the most important proposal in the history of peacemaking was the 1947 UN resolution to create a large Arab state with the Jews receiving two disjointed pieces consisting mostly of much of the coastline and the Negev desert. Jerusalem was to be internationalized. The Jews accepted the plan. The Arabs totally rejected it. Instead, they invaded the nascent Jewish state with the armies of 5 Arab nations, in hopes to drive the Jews into the sea, one of their favorite imageries. Of course, that isn't the way it turned out. Instead, about 650,000 Arabs fled the area, mostly under the goading of their leaders. Well, this is another lie. Cold-blooded murders by the Haganah and the Irgun, the Jewish militia armies of Palestine, deliberately created a wave of panic to expel these people from their homes, exactly as was charged to Milosevic in Bosnia and Kosovo a half-century later. The prime example was the Deir Yassin massacre of April 19, 1948, but there were others large and small, as recounted by Israeli historians Benny Morris and Ilan Pape. Ethnic cleansing, you must remember, is evil only when enemies do it. When we do it, meaning us good Western folks on the hard currency side of life, it's always the victim's fault, just for being victims. Remarkably, their descendants even today are called refugees, supported by the United Nations, which means mostly by the United States. This is more baloney. Palestinians own many businesses at home and abroad and send money home regularly to family. There are also Islamic charities, which is how Hamas originated, which is the main reason Israel wants it shut down as an independent lifeline of support for its colonial subjects. I'll return to the question of support in a bit. Every year for the last 60-plus years, the Arabs memorialize the Nakba, catastrophe of the creation of the State of Israel. But of course, without the war that they imposed on Israel, there would be no Nakba. Just as Israel, the Arabs would now be able to commemorate the 63rd anniversary of their Palestinian state. Well, this goes back again to the origin of the British Palestine Mandate, the betrayal of promises to Arab leaders of self-determination. If the bank makes a bogus foreclosure on your house, imagine that in our wonderful free enterprise system, but anyway, and its condition for your continued residence is to divide the house with another family it says had good credit and wants to move in there, it's only natural there will be strong disagreements as to the rights and wrongs of this. The new family, being favored by the bank officials, contrives to push the old family out altogether, declares the other party forfeit, and claims the whole house. The homeless family has a very persuasive case, in my verdict, an established one, that the whole procedure was a fraud. Even if the new residents make the claim that their grandfather once lived on the property a century ago before it was foreclosed on, actual possession is always 9/10 of the law, which is why Israel then and now is obsessed with creating facts on the ground. From 1948 to 1967, Jordan occupied the West Bank. During the 19 years of their tenure, not a word was heard about forming a Palestinian state in the area. After the 1967 Six-Day War, in which the Israelis trounced the combined armies of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, Jordan's occupation of the West Bank ended, and so did Egypt's occupation of Gaza. At that time, Israel offered the hand of friendship to the Arabs, which was rudely rejected when the Arabs issued the 3 no's of Khartoum: no peace, no negotiation, and no recognition of Israel. Another important opportunity that would have radically changed the history of the Middle East was missed. Well, who was offered the hand of friendship? Not the people of the occupied territories, now under alien rule. There was no mention of a Palestinian state under Jordan precisely because it was not a colonial regime then, imposed by a completely different culture and people. As Gandhi once said, people will prefer their own bad government to the rule of an alien power. And like the blind British colonials of that era, Israel has continuously maintained, but this is Jewish land, we're hardly an alien power. The refusal of the Arabs to accept this casuistry is the basis of their rejection of the so-called hand of friendship, and why the idea of a Palestinian state necessarily took form only after 1967. Onward and downwards. Never-ending efforts at peace. 1993 and 1995, Israel and the PLO signed the Oslo Accords with the aim of creating a Palestinian state within 5 years. Israel agreed to withdraw from parts of the West Bank and Gaza. Israel turned over most of its administration of the territories to the Palestinian Authority, the PA. But the Palestinians violated their commitments, thus scuttling the agreement. Well, more shallow rhetoric without substantiation. The so-called violations consisted of Yasser Arafat and the Palestinian Authority taking their claim of self-government seriously, and not ruling the population like a Bantustan of old South Africa as a proxy for the dominant regime. Any attempt to deal with the occupation's ongoing day-to-day brutality and not put the security needs of Israel, as defined by Israel, and its illegal settlers first, was interpreted as a violation. A teenage bus bomber hides in East Jerusalem. The PA police drag their feet in finding him, and this is a violation. Of course, the PA authorities must disregard the fact that the boy's brother is a tortured political prisoner, and the family's house was deliberately bulldozed, and their elderly parents stripped of all property. Disregard also that the Palestinian police would themselves become victims of popular anger if they did Israel's remote-controlled bidding. Anyway, in 2000, Prime Minister Ehud Barak offered to withdraw from 97%, of the West Bank and Gaza. That proposal was guaranteed, and proposal also guaranteed Palestinian refugees the right to return to the Palestinian state and offered reparations from $30 billion of international funds that would be collected to compensate them. Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat rejected the deal. And why not? How much of the reparations to be extracted from the alleged $30 billion was actually to be distributed, and by what means was it to be distributed? What the agreement did not do was address Israel's violations of the Oslo Accords in continuing to build illegal settlements and refusing to send their settlers home, or withdraw Israeli forces, with the illegal settlers being the excuse for the IDF to stay. What the PA was offered was a continued occupation with the show of autonomy, but not of any real military control of the state territory, which is the true measure of self-governing independence in a nation-state system. Anyway, onward here, if I can read this small print. No wonder they write it so small so that you can't actually read between the lines. But anyway, in 2003, Israel's Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, of late an unlamented memory, agreed to negotiate with the Palestinians according to the roadmap formulated by the United States, Russia, the European Union, and the UN. The Palestinians never fulfilled their obligation to normalize relations with Israel and to arrive at a comprehensive peace. Another missed opportunity. Well, I seem to recall that there were many agreements and a number of recognition of normalization on the Palestinian side, but again, the withdrawal was in the context of intensifying Israel's control over the West Bank, just like Begin swapping out the Negev Desert Zone. Israel still retained control over Gaza's borders, coastline, airspace, utilities, resources, and external trade, removing the settlers for a small price to retain overall ownership of the land. As for the new incursion into Gaza, the Goldstone report has pretty well demolished those pretexts. So much for this piece here, that in 2005, Israel unilaterally decided to evacuate every soldier and citizen from Gaza. The reward for Israel's evacuation was for the Palestinians to launch rockets into Israel from Gaza at an almost daily rate. There were further attempts in 2007 by Prime Minister Ehud Olmert and in 2010 by Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu, but all have ended in failure. Well, the Arabs killed were for the most part, as usual, not terrorists but unarmed civilians under the Israeli lex talionis of a life in retaliation for a bruise, a massacre for a knife wound. Again, the obligations the Palestinians allegedly missed out fulfilling are never enumerated, but we do know that Israel is not only obliged to stop new settlements, but to withdraw those already in existence. It has no intention of doing so, and in fact, in the wake of the tabled UN resolution regarding statehood, Bibi Netanyahu announced 1,100 new houses to be built in Gaza, as a deliberate slap at PA President Mahmoud Abbas for his temerity in going over the head of Israel and his bought and paid for ally, the United States. The above chronology is only a partial one, giving, I would say negating, only the most important highlights. There have been negotiations, conferences, plans, and meetings almost uninterruptedly. All of them have floundered. The all-or-nothing mentality of the Arabs, their unwillingness to recognize Israel as a Jewish state, and the Arabs' expressed desire to destroy the hated Jews have kept peace from flowering. What a shame! If the Arabs had accepted the 1947 partition plan and had not invaded the nascent Jewish state with the armies of 5 Arab countries, they would not now have the need to commemorate their Nakba. Well, there would inevitably be some backlash against Israel in the region, just as there has always been against the nation of Israel in Europe. Is the Holocaust held as the basis for recognizing European governments today? I don't think so. So it's disingenuous in the extreme to raise questions of genocide as the basis for accepting Israel. If Israel hadn't been built on the ruins of Arab villages and the leavings of their expelled residents, the hard feelings might well have largely healed by now. As it stands, they never will be. And it is Israel's rejectionism of anything but its own divine right to rule that is the obstruction. They could be celebrating the country's 63rd anniversary. They're enduring peace with Israel and could be part of the tremendous prosperity that Israel has brought to that region of the world. Prosperity? Where? Israel is a depressed economy kept afloat largely by United States taxpayer subsidy. It is not self-sustaining and never has been, nor has it ever intended to share any revenues with anyone but its own inner community, hence the need to redeem the land in the first place. So, knock on the phone. On the YouTube line, no less. Hello? King Louis XIV, the Sun King of France, what possible relevance do you have to this topic? What's that? Our viewers need to remember that those who rule were given their power by God. To resist that power is to defy the will of the Almighty. So that power can never be unjust, and submission to it is only duty to God. That's why you said, I am the state. Sounds like you could be the next Prime Minister of Israel. But I think you're a little rusty on your theology. Thomas Aquinas wrote, when there is no recourse to a superior by whom judgment can be made about an invader, like the United Nations, then he who slays a tyrant to liberate his fatherland is praised and receives a reward. I guess meaning his liberty. So either Thomas Aquinas was a Muslim Ayatollah, or Western values don't mean anything away from home, do they?